Azucena, Jorge, for giving me the middle presentation in the session after lunch, after 3 days of travel from South Africa. So if I stay awake through this presentation, hopefully everyone else will also. Please also, I'm South African, we speak fast. I'm privileged to have English as my first language. So shout, yell, tackle me if I'm going too fast or I'm incomprehensible. I might be incomprehensible even if I'm going slowly, but we try. So I had no idea what I was going to present for this conference. I was very excited to be able to have a chance to come to Saras that I've heard so much about. Lots of colleagues have worked here. So I thought, okay, this sounds like a perfect opportunity. What can I, as a generally confused sustainability scientist, writ large, contribute to this? So I've thrown together a random collection of slides. There might be some coherence, we shall see. Maybe it's emergent complexity. There's a lot of uncertainty linking into some of the presentations we've seen. But I think just as I've been reflecting through the presentations, maybe the root of what I'm going to present is embedded in 3 different projects that I can just sort of refer to now, and we can continue the conversation going forward. The first, it links to the work that Mika and Nacho have been doing around the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes project, about identifying good practices happening in the present that we want to take into the future, and unpacking this notion of Anthropocene and multiple futures. The second is work actually that David was involved in, and I realized there's still multiple connections with people in the room on transformation labs and this thinking of transformative spaces, and this idea that links to the morning session on safe enough spaces to be. Like, if we're thinking through transformation, there's probably an element of discomfort that we need to be feeling. But this notion of safe enough, we were talking about sort of infrastructures and during your presentation, Flor, and this notion of ethical engagement of who we bring in the room with particular subject matters when we're talking about participatory transdisciplinary research. And the third is, and don't worry, I've only got 10 slides, so I can take time to go on like this. And there are lots of pictures, so you can focus on them instead. The third is actually linked to the IPBES process, actually, where I sit on the task force on scenarios and models. That was the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that Stephen mentioned earlier, where we've developed this heuristic tool called the Nature Futures Framework, which is trying to actually unpack thinking through multiple futures that could be desirable and the plurality of what that means, taking diverse values into account that focus on hopefully being able to encapsulate multiple knowledge systems. So something really challenging, particularly for integrated assessment modelers, who are largely the audience that are talking about biodiversity or even energy futures, taking climate change into account. But thinking through, and it was sparked in your presentation when you had nature culture, because we have nature as culture as one of the corners of the triangle, with this nature for nature, this intrinsic kind of more than human recognition, and then this nature for society, the SDGs, right, that are very important. So that's something conceptually that maybe we can unpack. I don't have the figure because I realized it was really difficult to insert new figures during the course of the day. But anyhow, oh, that was undramatic. Okay. See, no, that. Sorry, that was supposed to be the flourish and it changed. So I was going to start with my standard tool of the close your eyes and think about a more desirable future. But I realize if you close your eyes now, at least if I did, I'd lose you immediately. So basically the point being is that I think we've largely seen when you do close your eyes and you get given the task to imagine if we got all the SDGs correct, if we managed to get it right, what does the future look like? It's pretty difficult to think through. It's just not something that we can cognitively unpack very easily. We need a lot of tools. And I think that this is where the connection with the humanities, with the arts, provide tools that science just doesn't have to be able to help people imagine sort of what getting things right could look like, not just how badly we're getting things wrong, which is what science is very good at showing us. and also critical social science, exactly how bad the science is at showing us how bad things are. So, you know, because we come back to reality, we're faced by this. These are just headlines from the past year. I think it's droughts, it's floods, it's heat waves, hurricanes. You know, this is what we're facing. It's very apocalyptic and it's very real to many people. And it connects to one of my way to go. Okay. It connects to one of the later slides. Sorry, the order is clearly not working. This idea by William Gibson that the future is already here, but it's unevenly distributed. And I think that this is exactly sort of what we're seeing around the world. Floods in Pakistan, we've had floods in KZN in South Africa, that the dire futures of climate change are already very real for many people. And this notion of apocalypse, right? And linking into Kyle White's reference, a scholar from the US, is that so many indigenous peoples have already faced apocalypse through colonization, right? This is not a new rodeo for them. This is very much cognitively something that they've had to deal with. And we need to recognize that and take it into account when we talk about these, you know, the urgency to act that we generally have as a planetary narrative. And so, yeah, because we're in this age, the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, the Cluthlocene, you know, these diverse ways of thinking through this planetary level crisis that we're experiencing. And how can you, something that I struggle with is how you can unpack sort of this planetary level crisis that's existential that we're facing, but from these diverse experiences and these marginalized knowledges and experiences that we actually have, and how do we reconcile that? It's a cross-scalar, multifaceted issue, and I think that the sciences don't necessarily have that tool to be able to work through that. And so we need different ways to engage. And it's something I struggle with, and it's something we were trying to bring together using the Nature Futures framework. And so, yeah, what are the kinds of stories that we see around us? Sort of delving into, and I'm in no way connected with humanities literature. I have to rely largely on Azucena for helping our students through this. But, you know, you just take a general swing through things. The movie 2012, Last Hours of Humanity, The Sixth Extinction, Mad Max Fury Road with our very own Charlize. At least we have one cool South African in the US, unlike the other one that's trying to take over Mars, amongst other things. The Day After Tomorrow, The Uninhabitable Earth. I mean, fantastic, wonderful. You know, these warning signs are real. They're very clear. We're very good at telling these kinds of stories. We're less good at telling the sorts of stories that are going well. But I think that's starting to change with the solar punk movement, with other kinds of what I'm going to refer to African futurist narratives of, if we take a step back, can we reimagine what kinds of pathways we might be able to take? So that's where this is going, in case you were wondering. There's the slide I was looking for. That was 4 slides too late. William Gibson, Future's Already Here, unevenly distributed. And the future's here in terms of both positives and negatives. So we're good at seeing the bad things, but we're also that the seeds of good Anthropocene's idea of that there are places where things are working. I was super inspired by what the University of Cordoba is doing. Like, I think South African universities have so much to learn from that process. And it's a privilege that you can have those kinds of conversations. And so good things are also happening. And can we harness that to sort of help us imagine the kinds of interventions that we would like to take into the future? So Lao Tzu, probably not, but it's attributed to him. This idea of transformation, if you don't change direction, you may land up where you're heading, I think is the perfect example of our standard climate change projections, right? Or our biodiversity loss. So like, we're going this way, we need to bend the curve, we need to change direction, but where is it? Where is it that we want to go, right? Like, what are these futures? What does it mean to change direction from where we're currently heading? And that's a question that fascinates me. And I think that it's something really interesting as a collaborative effort that we could start to unpack together. And this is an image. Henrik earlier today was talking about Andrew Mary's Radical Ocean Futures project. So this is an image by Simon from that, which I find really powerful to actually convey the questions that we're using. So you'll be able to get distracted by artwork and not listen to me if you also want to. So an interesting point that sort of Real Miller makes, who is the former UNESCO chair on anticipation, our futures literacy, who works on that, was, you know, as soon as you start to think about knowing potential futures, they're going to be outdated, basically, right? As soon as we have some level of certainty in what we're doing, it's already too late to start think about the sorts of futures. So what are the capacities that we need to generate to be able to almost preempt and to be comfortable with the uncertainty, but still with that uncertainty, have agency to still act in particular directions? And I think that that's an interesting sort of challenge that we face, particularly within academia, to be able to inculcate that. Yeah, and so we need to both develop these capacities to envision where it is we want to go, but also to be able to deal with the fact that that's not where we're going to go, right? That it's about a capacity, it's about a literacy, it's about a capability that we need to start generating, I think, collectively. And so this is an offering from a young white female South African perspective, but drawing lots on from work that's been happening on the continent and other discussions that we're having, but very important to put my positionality within what I'm going to present. So the first sort of point that we've been discussing is this need to revive our very colonized imaginations, right? This notion of what development looks like, where we want to go, what is progress, what is modernity, very colonial notions of these trajectories that we're trying to go on. And I think it's the imagination that can help us break through those sorts of dominant narratives. So a quote here from Ben Okri, you know, he talks about knowledge being empty without imagination, that no civilization ever got great on knowledge alone. There's this idea about imagination helping us to transcend conventional thinking, to envision new possibilities, where particular and stable facts and data mixing with shifting emotions and memory and intention. And we were just talking about the need over lunch around this engagement with emotions that science just doesn't really deal with, that natural science doesn't really deal with all that well. And yet it's fundamental to the kinds of shifts that we're trying to inculcate. And then I think a very important point that was already made in '92 by Beck about this idea that when people are unable or unwilling to incorporate novelty into the way they think about the future, or to find a place for the rich emergence of that potential uncertainty, then the lived experience of change becomes disorienting. And this is where you get defensive and nostalgic reactions. And I think the rise of populism that we've seen globally is very much this. It's a pushback. It's a defensive reaction to change because we don't have the capacities to incorporate novelty, to incorporate difference. Not we, but that there's a collective lack globally on this. So interesting to sort of unpack, I think, also from a political science perspective. So what is the input here? Speculative fiction, science fiction. And again, really interesting that the best image that I can find globally on the internet, which is basically globally, is a picture of Wakanda, right? So a very Afro-futurist take on things, but still important from a narrative perspective. But as Ivor Hartman quoted, and he quoted Nnedi Okorafor in this African speculative fiction anthology, the first one that was published in 2012, which talks about science fiction is the only genre that enables African writers to envision a future from an African perspective. And the value of this can't be overstated, because the important point here is that if you can't see and relay an understandable vision of the future, your future will be co-opted by someone else's vision who may not necessarily have your best interest at heart. And I think this is really the underlying decolonial message, with sort of understanding all of the discussions and the rich sort of writing that's gone underlying that word. But it's really about the capture of your future by someone else's sort of more dominant way of thinking. And speculative fiction is one tool that we've been able to see But I think there are a variety of others that we could probably also start to bring to bear to help in this movement. So the second one is embracing diverse knowledge systems. I don't think anyone in the room here needs to be convinced about that. But the great image already from Maria Tengo, colleague at SRC's figure in 2014 on this idea of multiple knowledge systems coming together, bearing in mind Ritori Chakrabarty's quote on we should not be sacrificing equity on the altar of integration. So it's not all about being the same, right? Because we know historically, as soon as we try and equate knowledge systems, that they tend to be dominated. And that's a historical dominance around Western scientific thought. But it's about recognizing and being comfortable with difference, right? Different ways of seeing things and not trying to put them all into the same basket. And this is where that reference to Carl White that I mentioned on time as kinship, on this notion of emergency, right? That we need to act now, but largely acting now still has implications, particularly in the global South, particularly for marginalized communities. I was sitting at the Tipping Points conference in Exeter 2-3 months ago. And I'll come to the point that I made there in my last slide. But, you know, once again, the white South African representing a continent at the table, and it's starting to get really old. And, you know, being able to say it out loud, I think that comfort of being able to say these things is important. But yeah, you know, we're talking about, we're reaching a tipping point in terms of energy transitions in Europe. Electric vehicles are, you know, sort of on the rise compared to fossil fuel based vehicles. And I'm like, but where are those batteries coming from? We think that the fact that the constitution in Chile didn't get passed had like nothing whatsoever to do with the fact that we need lithium, cobalt from either deep sea or from the Congo, right? In order to still maintain individual vehicles, right, as this notion. But the transition is here. I was like, no, it's definitely not. We need to move in very different ways. But again, those narratives of what change looks like coming from a particular perspective that we then to start laud, I think is something we really need to unpack. And so throwing out Sankofa, and it was mentioned actually in something else, and this is an ACOM term that means to go back and get it. So it's unpacking the directionality of how we think about futures, right? It's about recognizing a past in Africa. This connection to ancestors is really, really strong. And so you can, and I did this in Mexico and I realized it's very performative, but you can go forward whilst looking backwards, right? And that's an interesting notion, right? Yeah, and it's associated with the proverb that it's not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten, which I think is really important. We can think about futures whilst recognizing pasts that have been erased or that have been eroded. Right, so finally, there are only 3 points, don't worry. Invest in inclusive participatory processes. So we've also been discussing that largely. We've heard a lot of examples. This was one from the high seas that we did using the Nature Futures framework, but I think the fisheries example that that Mika presented is another really good way of like bringing people together, because you're able to do 1 and 2 if you have sort of the right processes to be able to actually do this. And we used arts. Actually, I got Claire, an artist in South Africa, to come and help us navigate. And we had hardcore like physical scientists, like UN negotiators in a room, and then they got really messy with a whole lot of paint, and it was amazing. We did only do it on the 3rd day though, and they knew they couldn't leave for another 2 days. So you also got to get them to a remote location. So yeah, these are some other examples that we've had. This is Muti and Clema at a workshop I ran in Malawi in the Nzimba Kingdom on envisioning alternative futures using the Nature Futures framework. He's a speculative fiction writer from Malawi. So again, I've asked him and another colleague of his we've commissioned speculative fiction stories as outputs from this workshop rather than a scientific paper. We'll probably have to write that too, but it's a different way of being able to capture the sorts of richness of the stories that were emerging. There's an Our Move Next is an anthology that was written during the pandemic from South African authors or African authors on. No, it's Our Move Next. This needs to come from somewhere other than the West, right? In terms of thinking through what the alternatives are, which I found quite powerful. And Rob Benjamin, I quite like using an adaptive 3 horizons framework, but she talks about, remember to imagine and craft the world you cannot live within, just as you dismantle the ones that you cannot live without. And I think that that's also a challenge to us, or we're not just about coming up with the challenges in the present. We tend to get really, really focused on trying to overcome challenges in the present, but we also need to build the kinds of futures that we want to go towards. And that's a much more challenging situation. So finally, this is an image that I threw in that as Hussein and I have been working together on trying to bring multiple different ways of thinking through the future into one diagram. So there's this idea of the Voros futures cone, where it's not just a projected future, but you have all the way through to preposterous futures, which connects quite well to modelers thinking, right? Sort of you can still take a Western scientific notion of the future and widen it in interesting ways. You can make it multiple from different perspectives too, but you also need to think of potentially Sankofa, alternative ways of going forward whilst looking backwards, or just cyclical notions, right? And that's really difficult for us as scientists to think through cyclical notions of futures coming back. But I think it's something we need to deal with. And conceptually, hopefully this works. Also recognizing that as we've got multiple futures, we understand, but we also have multiple paths and experiences that lead to multiple presents. And that in and of itself is also quite a difficult concept to convey. And so finally, I mentioned I was at the Tipping Points conference, and this is the sort of the final point, was that I was asked to talk about positive tipping points. And like, are there such things? We could unpack that. I'm at this realm of questioning through, okay, what would a radical tipping point be at the planetary level, taking this notion of what if we'd never been colonized? Right? Like, what could the sort of futures be if we could go back to that point and reimagine? And so some of this has already been said. You can see that the notion on economics actually comes in, bringing in post-growth economics, not just degrowth. But we talk about animism and entanglement and messy complexity, right? Rather than dualistic notions of dichotomies. This idea of Ubuntu, I am because of others, not just competition, right? This idea of why do we have nation states? Mobility, right? End of visas, this free sort of movement of people, right? Is a new notion. It's not a given, but yet we've been forced to think that, nation states are delineated. And most of the scenarios or the futures work I run, mainly with the youth, is like, yeah, we can't do that with the current nation state apparatus. We need to break that down. We need different governance mechanisms. So we can do it at a problem-based level. We were talking about water. Our governance systems aren't set up at the appropriate jurisdictional levels for the kinds of challenges that we face. Can we rethink that? Can we rethink this idea of ownership and private property that has become so predominant globally, which also comes from one particular way of viewing the world? Thinking through this notion of equity, right? Race, gender, religion, geography, right? Which is important. And again, the economics. So finally, The Economist in 2011. Yes, I did end with a quote from The Economist. Take that. Is that humans have changed the way the world works. We have to change the way we think about it too. And I think that that's where this sort of collaborative practice can be really powerful in helping us to do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Are there questions, comments?
Okay. I have an undergraduate degree in zoology, ecology, and law, master's degree in human geography, PhD in confused geography. Yeah, I've worked at governance schools. I've worked in science faculties, in social science faculties. I haven't done engineering.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Laura. I was wondering if you could share with us some challenges that you've faced in these participatory workshops in which you invite people to think about the future. And I mean, it's a big question, but maybe with a couple of examples of how to overcome those challenges when there's resistance or reluctance or difficulties to think about desirable futures, and how to live the present or forget about it for a minute.
So participation in two different ways. One is in scenarios, thinking through good futures, desirable futures. And the other is just in thinking through this idea of transformative spaces, bringing people into a room to give their time for generally 3-4 days if you're going to do something really well. So number one, there's an ethical question you have to ask yourself as to why you are convening a participatory process, because we could be very extractive, right? And quite often as academics, we still have to write the papers, we have to run through that. But what is it that you're also offering to the participants? Why is it that they want to be there? And I think that's the first question. And that can come from engaging with them, having worked very collaboratively from the beginning with them. And so already having that desire or that transparency as to why we're in the room together, I think is the first point. And that can be a challenge, because sometimes your project wants to do something, but people are like, but this is pointless. Why am I here? And then you have to ask them some difficult questions, right? Or what are the incentives? I've had another ethical dilemma on this thinking through desirable futures, particularly in conflict situations, right? And we've been asked now to do it around peace and stability. I had to run a workshop in Jordan, and then for UNDP and the CG system, climate securities in Jordan, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Somalia. And I was like, on good futures, like this is like, why are we here? And I was super skeptical, but I thought, all right, let's try it. And we did it in person in Jordan. And it was actually amazing, because everyone was really empowered that they could have the chance of thinking through what it might look like if we got it right. And you had to make huge assumptions on, we need to change the current politics, but it could get better. And I think that, so just deeply questioning, why is it we're talking about futures? Because it can be powerful, but in sort of very contested situations where people don't have agency necessarily to envision those, or to actually enable those kinds of futures, there's a question you need to ask around that. So those are the two main ones of like why you get people in a room to do a participatory process. And the third is the ethics of what you're trying to even generate from that. And I think that's where the seeds, the kinds of work that you were doing with the coastal fishes seeds that we've done with other food seeds has been really interesting, because you can see why people want to be in that room. You can see the connections, the stories, the emotions that come out the other end, and a generation of agency. So that's the kind of participatory work I think I really like doing. But there are always going to be challenges around, do you then bring corporates into the room, right? You need diversity. How much diversity is right? And that's a question each individual project just has to grapple with. And we can share how we got it really, really wrong in the first T-Lab in South Africa, which I think David knows about. But then you've just got to be honest and go back and try again and make sure that you can do better.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing that image. The image of the diagram of futures. I'm still processing it, but I had a sense that the diagram seems to be offering a vision of the future as an extended present. What I'm trying to get is one thing that has collapsed is the modern vision of future, right? It's no longer the side with unlimited resources. It's no longer the side of unlimited change. It's no longer the hope that we can start all over again, right? And there is a lot about on literature about that, is the possibility of going back to the origins and start all over again. And to a certain degree, then the future has become, since the future in terms of prediction is happening already, then the future has become an extended present. It's still something, it's no longer something yet to come. It's something already happening. But most important, I think that the melancholia or the anxiety about the future has to do with the collapse of the future as that site, where at the end of the day was the source of all hope. Because in that idea of future, everything could be reinvented. And it seems to me that that is down, that has died. And the other thing that I wonder how would you like to consider is maybe rephrasing the question on what would have happened if we had not been colonized to something like, what would have been happened if we have not all been involved one way or another in colonialism? We have the meeting of the network the other night. There was a very interesting conversation that made me think about that. One of our colleagues was presenting in Wembivir, the good life, and it's just like Sankofa is the same idea of in Andean cosmologies of moving forward by taking a look to the past. And there was another colleague doing a rereading of Enlightenment thinkers, European Enlightenment thinkers, trying to find equality in terms of gender, different relationship with natures. And then the discussion moved immediately into, as if we had in front of us, was if there was a way of saving modernity from itself. But what I was listening was, I was listening to a colleague doing with European philosophy what Wembivir is recommending. Look in your own past, look for your alternatives in your own past, reread your own past, and make your own past the source of innovation for dealing with the problems to come. So I thought I was watching a European scholar doing its own version of Wembivir without knowing that it was what he was doing. But on the other hand, the idea that you're trying to save modernity. So that's what pushes me to thinking if we can rephrase the question in terms, what would have been the world be if we all have not been involved in the process of colonialism?
So starting with that very, very quickly, I mean, and just good comments. I think, and I think you can, it's just important to put multiple provocative questions like that out in multiple different formats. And I think I find this one most useful, not in global South settings where everyone knows that they're grappling with that. And it's difficult to imagine, but actually in European settings, right? And you look at Sweden, right? And colonization that's happened internally in Europe. And this idea that Europeans were even colonized by the Enlightenment, right? And I think so that is about that inclusive. We've all been complicit. We have not all been. It's like the anthropos. So I think that's also depending on the audience of the we that you're unpacking. It's also important to think through. But it really is about can you force yourself to go through this notion that this is not necessarily stable fact, that there are lots of narratives that have been built into why we think in the way that we do. And that hurts my brain in the same way that your question on this notion of futures hurts my brain, right? Multiple presents, is it there, is it back? And honestly, I can say I don't know, but I think we need to grapple with what it means. And we need to do more of this kind of work. And that's just still a work in progress, that figure. But it was starting to capture some of the multiplicities, right, that we were encountering, and we didn't quite know how to conceptualize because we were so used to this trajectory of going forward. So we need the loop, we need the multiple presents, understanding the past and going back. And I think that maybe my biggest issue is the sort of melancholic loss of the future and its potential, which is why I think we talk to African futurism, right, to speculative fiction, to solar punk stories, to try and recapture a notion of a potential future. That again is not a projection, it's not a prediction, but it's a reorientation of how we can think and conceptualize things so that you make different choices in the present. I think that's the point of futures thinking. It's anticipatory governance, is that you can unpack multiple futures so that you make different choices now. And so the present is linked, it's that thick present. But yeah, it's something we can maybe solve by tomorrow, probably not. voy a responder en inglés.
Sí. I understand English, but I only speak a little. Encontré muy interesante tu presentación, principalmente la propuesta de imaginación geográfica radical que colocas. Recordé el trabajo del geógrafo crítico Derek Gregory, que retoma la idea del pensamiento postcolonial, hablando de esta imaginación geográfica radical en términos políticos que requiere de plantear otros futuros posibles. Nosotros hemos trabajado con diversos pueblos indígenas en América Latina y con uno en particular hemos encontrado dos experiencias o dos ideas fuerza que también son provocadoras como las que tú has puesto y me gustaría contarlas, ¿sí? Trabajamos con el pueblo Wayuu y el pueblo Añú, que son dos pueblos de la frontera entre Colombia y Venezuela, y ellos dicen que el futuro no existe. El futuro es solo una invención moderno-colonial y solo existe el presente y el pasado. Y ellos colocan una metáfora que tiene que ver con su ontología territorial. Es un pueblo que navega por las aguas y dicen que cuando uno navega en un lago, no hay un camino, sino que hay miles de caminos posibles. El camino siempre es diferente. Pero lo que guía el curso de la embarcación es la estela del agua que ha quedado atrás. Entonces, esa metáfora que proviene de su territorialidad marca la concepción de futuro. El pasado es lo que guía, la huella que está atrás. Y esa es una idea muy potente para repensar las cuestiones ambientales en América Latina, los imaginarios de desarrollo, las políticas extractivas. El segundo concepto es el concepto de naturaleza, que es tan importante como el de tiempo. Y aquí en América Latina hoy día hablamos del concepto de colonialidad de la naturaleza. Hay un artículo muy provocador acerca de eso, que es del geógrafo Eric Swinhoe, que dice la naturaleza no existe. Es un cuestionamiento radical. Y lo que nos han dicho en el trabajo que hemos realizado, los compañeros de los territorios, es que el concepto de naturaleza no está en su lengua. Solo existen relaciones con otros, que pueden ser humanos o no humanos, que tienen agencia, ¿sí? Y eso es muy potente porque habla de otra forma de construcción de la relación, no entre cultura y naturaleza, sino que entre múltiples actores que entran en relaciones de vida. Son dos ideas muy potentes que quería compartir porque creo que hay algo que une también esas otras epistemologías desde estas conexiones del sur. Eso.
Gracias, Pablo. And your examples speak for themselves. So yes, and I think we need more of that. I think, and this is something which is also a call to help from the IPES perspective on the task force on scenarios and models, where we have this nature futures framework. And I led the first paper, and it was great. It was in People and Nature. So I had the option to publish, I think, 20 resumos, abstracts and sort of short summaries. And I did it in languages. I did it I got colleagues in Yoruba, in Hausa, in Hindi and Arabic. Arabic, you can't say futures. There's only one. It's impossible to say multiple, right? This idea of, and we were trying to, within the Nature Futures framework, still understand the tools and models we've developed that has society, nature, this division, but also have a third corner where that dichotomy is not how people understand the world, right? This notion of nature, but we still had to use the language. We're also using English, no? And to try and unpack what that could look like is a plea to everyone and colleagues, because we're trying to do justice within this intergovernmental process. And it's hard, but it's important because so much of this way of seeing has been completely undermined.
How did you resolve that?
We haven't yet. We did nature as culture, but we still use the word nature. And I think what we're trying to do now, we're running a workshop in Colombia, actually, in Leticia, in February, where we're going to try and do it more participatory. We had 2 years of online discussions, impossible, right, to talk through this, to try and capture, to see whether we can do better. And we have a triangle and now a blurry, it looks like the Nature Futures framework on LSD that Bolivia brought into the conversation importantly. So like we can't think of it along these axes, but we need these axes if we're going to model things, and we need the modelers to do better work at encapsulating these diverse perspectives. So it's a constant struggle. But I think language plays an important part. And if we can come up with phrases that on English, and I'm culpable, I'm sitting here in Uruguay speaking English to everyone. But yeah, if we can come up with that conception, maybe that's a start.
Have you thought, or have you tried to bring in professional translators, literary translators, people who struggle with the kind of really sticky dimensions of linguistic transference?
So no, we haven't, not official translators. We worked with people who speak the language, but also converse in English, and saying like, how would I try and say this to my community, to my grandmother, etc. But yeah, maybe that's a good thought. People who deal with this all the time.
Hola. Yeah. Maybe I was thinking in something that is a chaotic theory for Prigozhin, that maybe it's very interesting to try to think this with that perspective, because in that way, you know that you have only very, very short time. Yeah. The futures are constructed in very short time. And I don't know, I was thinking in that, and it's an idea only.
Yeah, perhaps on the same line. For me, I'm afraid of thinking too much about the future. We'll actually create frustration, illusion, and we miss opportunities. So what if, going to Prigozhin, it's more about, first of all, knowing where we don't want to go, which is this Chinese idea of not going to the path that you already know what's going to take you to a bad place. And then having small rules that we think work very well for us to follow good opportunities and avoid bad pathways. But there's so much uncertainty everywhere in our very minimalistic lives and in the planet, with examples with the previous extinctions. So I wonder how much we need very, very powerful future images, or maybe they are creating frustration. Or so it's a question. I don't need the answer.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Laura. You have really made us imagine a lot of things. I started thinking about the presentation, thinking in terms of decolonization, and I got stuck, or sort of heard that it had to do, according to what you presented, with the decolonization of the past, because I understood that was a sort of the beginning. But then I heard Jorge, I heard Pablo, and each time I was saying, yes, but it is also a matter of decolonization of the, well, you said the imagination as well, the epistemology, the epistemology as well. So, but probably the most basic thing is the language. And I don't think it's the first act of imagination, and is the most, well, I don't want to say the most human act, because animals also have some kind of language, but it's a kind of, this is what we always do when we believe that we can do things and change things, establish a conversation, establish a dialogue. So it has a power to to name things, to define things, to understand things. So it's not only a matter of translators. It has to be someone who also thinks about, is capable of shifting from one paradigm to another. So the question is, this beginning question. So do we have to recover our past if they are, well, the Europeans have to recover their past, the Latin Americans have to recover their past, but also the native people had to recover their past. Well, I guess what we have to recover is the present or the future. I don't know if the future, as he says, but thinking in terms of, I think that the most I got with this idea, get away with this idea of language as the most imaginative tool, and that makes us understand the world in one way or the other. And this is what we have to decolonize, I think.
So I think we need to do all the things all at the same time. I don't think it's an either or situation. So when we're thinking of multiple futures, sort of, I sit there, I remember sitting in the Global Environment Outlook, leading a chapter in the previous assessment as a CLA, and just looking around the room and being like, I'm still going to be here in 60 years and none of you are. So I need much better stories of what it could look like. Like 2100 is not far-fetched. They were like, that's impossible to think. I'm like, but no, that could potentially be maybe 2080 in my lifetime. No, it was a generational question in terms of like, I need that if I'm going to continue to do the work that I do. But it can be dangerous. It's taken as a discourse, and it's kind of this planetary management towards this singular vision. So I think it's about multiple plurality, using it to think about the present, not as a direction, as a broad space, which is contrary to where we're going. And I think we need work on that. I think, so art has been really powerful. It's not about words, it's about representation in different ways. And I found that to be a really great way to sort of get beyond language barriers of understanding. And I sort of a lot of kudos to artists to be able to take that, because I'm completely useless at it. But I think that's another powerful tool that we have: music, dance, theater, right? Performativity, right? And multiple different ways of thinking through that don't give us these language barriers. And I haven't read Pigogine since my PhD, but yes, this idea of emergence, right? And it's about where do you want to go? But you have these tipping points, these moments, like in the present, to go one step this way, and it opens up a whole other sort of potential future. And it's that uncertainty, again, it's not predictive. It's about imagination and how that can help us. It's not a pathway necessarily. But yes, so I think we can learn from multiple different disciplines in terms of conceptualizing this. And I think a lot of that work has been done, but we need to be better at bringing it together. Laura out. Thank you.